All right, hello. Today is Monday, the 23rd of November, and this is AP Euro discussing the transatlantic economy. Take two. Yeah. Before we go into that, let's look at a picture that has absolutely nothing to do with the subject matter. Um, yeah. That's me. Yeah, in fact, I'm still in that vehicle. And if you look at the surrounding area, I'm sure that many of you can recognize this is the crest of the hill on US 42 headed towards Florence there. And I think I've told some of you guys about this. This was the wreck. That's the Chevy Tahoe that hit me head on, and it flipped over after first landing on top of this vehicle here and then sliding down. I was driving in this lane, in this direction, and yeah. And the reason my good friend, Mr. Dean Maria, uh, suggested I show this to you guys because you guys are sophomores. You're 16. You're about to drive. Now, keep in mind in that wreck, I was not speeding. I was not drinking or doing anything like that. That's just how fast things happen on the road. And, you know, so yeah, take that with you when you take your driver's test. Those things happen. And enough of that. Thank you very much. Now, let's talk about this. Yes. The Spanish Colonial Empire. Now, the Spanish Colonial Empire was directed from the top, and with that was the first to fall apart. What does that mean? It means that the Spanish set up their empire to be administered directly by the crown, by the king, queen, or whoever's running things, for the benefit of the crown. And because of that, that was one of the reasons why the Spanish Colonial Empire was the first one to fall apart. Because, for one thing, they couldn't really get a lot of Spanish people to go and move into the empire. Why would they? Why would you go live in some godforsaken wilderness, which is what the Americas were, when you weren't going to be able to make any money? I mean, a few were able to come to the Western Hemisphere and settle and, made some money, but the great majority, no. And the Spanish crown king governed these tightly, tried to tightly control the administration from the top, and there was no investment, of labor, was no investment of people. Unlike if you recall, the British colonies, the British colonies, they succeeded because it was a way where the British pretty much left the 13 colonies alone after they were founded. They let the companies run the colonies. They let the people develop a type of self-government as loyal British subjects. By comparison, the Spanish colonial empire was supposed to be just an extension of Spain. The governing of the Spanish American colony was assigned to an organization called the Council of the Indies, and the Indies meant the West Indies, the Caribbean. That's where it first, and then spread out. Each of the viceroyalties, and the viceroyalties was a ruling district, looks like a test question word, viceroy within the Spanish Empire. Viceroyalty was then divided into several subordinate judicial councils known as audiencias. And when you see words in italics there, those look like Horton test words. These, audiencias were led by officials called corregidores. The House of Trade, in Spanish, Casa de Contrición, in Seville, regulated all trade with the New World. See, it was tightly regulated. And the profit motive was totally taken out. All profit went to the crown. Its members worked closely with the Consulado, the Merchant Guild, and other groups involved with American commerce in the Spanish city of Cadiz. Each year, a fleet of commercial vessels called the flota, controlled by Seville merchants and escorted by Spanish warships, carried merchandise from Spain to a few ports in the Americas and brought back lots and lots and lots of gold and silver, particularly silver. The fact of the matter is, early in the 17th century, forgive me, I'm going to yawn. You don't want to see that. Anyway, early in the 17th century, a large flotilla of about 18 galleons, 18 Spanish galleons, loaded to the gills with precious stones, but mostly silver, were passing in the straits between Florida and Cuba. And when they were set upon by just a wicked storm that sank the whole fleet, sending them to the bottom, and their loads, what they were carrying, the silver, tons of silver, it's never been found. Anyway, it's buried under sand now, just thought you'd like to know that. So, the War of Spanish Succession and the Treaty of Utrecht of 1715 ended the Habsburg family's domination of Spain in favor of a new ruling family called the Spanish Bourbons. Yes, related to Louis XIV's Bourbons. Under the Bourbons, Philip V, Spanish coastal patrols tried to suppress smuggling in, I should write, Latin American waters, as well as piracy. This was the golden age of piracy, the 18th century. And most of the pirates were located in the Caribbean, around the Gulf, as in Tampa Bay Buccaneers, yes, who raided not only, of course, the Caribbean, they also raided shipping up and down the east coast of what is now the United States. Under Ferdinand VI, Spain's naval weaknesses were exposed, especially after Spain was on the losing side of the French and Indian War. Going forward until 1815, in most of these wars we're about to talk about, you have Britain on one side, France on the other, but France will always be accompanied by the little crony Spain. That's what I refer to. Spain is like France's little crony that does the wicked stuff that they want to, although they're not very good. I mean, the Spanish kept losing. They spent all their money, basically. So, Charles III did the most to reform the Spanish Empire. Charles used royal ministers and diminished the roles of the Casa de Contrition to control, don't you like how I say that? To control the House of Trade. He opened more South American and Caribbean ports to trade, and in 1776, oh, look at that date, he organized another viceroyalty to govern the southern tip of South America, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia. And he also began to use intendants, if you recall that word from Louis XIV, they were like spies, to do his special work. Okay, let's learn something. These reforms brought the empire under more Spanish direct Spanish control, but many issues remain. Let's roll the tape. You want to, where did that go? You want to, I thought that I had. There it is. You want to take a snapshot of this because this will show up on future tests. And this, and it's not just of the colonial empire. This is the way that if you go to Latin America today, Central and South America today, you find the same type of social hierarchy. But let's go over them first, because these words here are on your test. Okay. Now, in the Spanish American colonial empire, people lived in very rigidly assigned social classes. at the top. And by the way, it's pictured as a pyramid because this is a population pyramid grid as well. I'm sure you guys who took AP Human Geography with Miss Croman last year recall something like this. Because what this shows is not only control of society, the higher up you are, the more control you have, but it also shows the distribution of population. In other words, the further down the pyramid you are, there are more people. Okay? Understand Sie das? Comprende? N'est-ce pas? So, at the top of the social scale and controlling everything were these people called, see them there, peninsulares. And I believe they're listed on your terms. These are there, and these guys, you say, who are they? Well, they're the ones who had all the executive offices in the governorship of the colonies and also the army. They had all the best jobs. But to be a peninsulare, you had to be born in the Iberian Peninsula. Mr. Horton and his big words, Iberian Peninsula. What does that mean? It means Spain and Portugal. Iberian Peninsula, Spain. And so, yeah, to be in this class, you had to be born there and then transferred to the New World. But what about your children? Well, that's these guys. Creoles. These are Europeans who were born in Latin America of your direct European, and I hate to use the word pure European, descent. Yeah, no native ancestry at all. Now, let's learn this word. You know, I've been teaching this class or a class like this for 40 years, and I've been teaching this pyramid for 40 years, and I've been using this word for about the same amount of time. And it was only when I came here to Ryle that I'd ever been in a school that had a significant Latino population. And I've become very close to some of my Latino students. And one of my Latino students told me that this word, mestizos, which is a combination of European and Indian ancestry, and see, here's the thing. When the Spanish came over, Spanish officers, Spanish conquistadors, Spanish settlers, the fact of the matter was they didn't bring any women. And so, or many. And so many of them, some of them probably married Native Americans, but a lot of them probably just had sex with Native Americans. And then the union resulted in children. The term for such children or such ancestors are mestizos. And what I did not find out until just a few years ago, since I've been around, many Latino people in American culture, and I mean North and South America, think that word means dirty. It's a bad word. I didn't know. But at any rate, these are a mix of my wife's one. My wife is Colombian, but you can tell by looking at her that she's Native American, but she has European. I mean, for example, I hope I don't embarrass her. There are certain traits that Native American populations have, particularly in South America. For example, my wife has no hair on her arms, armpits. I mean, I asked her, I said, don't you don't have to get a razor to shave your armpit? No, she doesn't have any hair. It's different. I thought that was interesting, also very convenient. But yeah, she's one of these. And here's the other thing, though. My wife, many Latin American people are embarrassed by this, by having an ancestry that is Native American. I mean, it's dumb to be embarrassed by it, but it's fact of the matter is. But yeah, so mestizos. Under them are mulattoes, and next year when you take American History AP, you're going to see this term, particularly when you talk about slaves. Um, by the same token, a lot of Europeans came and intermingled with not Native Americans, with African slaves. And I'm sure that the intermingling, I use that, that's a polite word. They had sex. Thomas Jefferson, for goodness sake. I'm sure that in most of the incidences, the sex was not consensual. Yeah. But yeah, and the term for people who have that descendancy, that heritage, is mulatto. And like I said, next year when you take AP American, you'll read a lot of documents that refer to people of color in the 19th century America as mulatto, meaning that they have both European and African descendancy. Now, I was looking at another chart, by the way, and another step on this hierarchy was called ZAMBOS, Zambos, which means Native American and African descendancy, for what that's worth. Okay, now under them are the Native Americans who lived in Central and South America. And then at the very bottom are African slaves. So, yeah. But now here's the thing. And the reason why you need to remember this scale. If you go to any Latin American country nowadays and look at the population hierarchy, look who owns the wealth, look who runs things, that pyramid still exists. I mean, you erase the line between Peninsulares and Creoles, of course, but the control of Latin American countries, by and large, is European based. And that's unfortunate, but all too true. So, yeah, it's an interesting factoid. But this pyramid and these words, yeah, are worth committing to memory. Okay? So you have a picture of that. You can always look at it, and I'll take that away. All right. So, but see, these two groups, Peninsulares and the Creoles, this is going to be trouble going forward in Central and South America. In fact, the revolutions that liberate all the countries of Central and South America from Mexico all the way down to the tip of South America, the revolutions are led by Creoles who were made to feel like second-class citizens. Okay. Roman numeral 6. Of course, the work of the Americas and the profit was borne largely on the backs of slaves. After, and this is going over old territory, after the conquest of Constantinople by the Turks in 1453, the Ottoman Turks would not allow any white slaves from their controlled regions. And so the Portuguese began to trade in Africa for slaves of color. And then, and this is where slavery changes from being the slavery of the household servant in the Shakespeare's day, the Renaissance, to being chattel slavery, where slaves were rounded up, chained together, beaten, and treated like animals in what we now think of as slavery. And the reason was, once again, money. Because of the labor-intensive nature of the most profitable crops, sugarcane, cotton, tobacco, rice, indigo, etc., 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 slavery became the centerpiece of the colonial economies of the Caribbean, South America, and the southern British colonies, going all the way from Georgia to Maryland. Although slavery was legal in all of the 13 American colonies except Pennsylvania. Yeah, Quakers didn't want no part of it. Anyway, which African tribes were taken into slavery was the result of their location. All the slaves who were brought into the Western Hemisphere came from within about 150 miles of the Atlantic coast in West Africa. It was convenient. And once again, and I think I've mentioned this before, Europeans didn't go into Africa and snatch them. No, they were taken by other Africans. Yeah, Europeans will not enter Africa until the latter part of the 19th century because they're afraid of diseases. But other Africans went into Africa, snatched up slaves, sold them to Europeans for guns, gunpowder, and strong whiskey. Rum, actually. All right, so D. Only 10% of all slaves went to North America. The rest went to the Caribbean and South America. African slaves often surpassed the number of white people living in the Caribbean and South America. That's true. Quite true. Jamaica, Haiti, places like that, their populations are descendants of slaves. Prosperity and slavery went hand in hand. And like I said, I'm watching a educational video called The Forgotten Slave Owners, about people who owned slaves, and particularly British subjects who then were compensated for those slaves. New slaves were needed because the fertility rates of the earlier slaves were low and their mortality rates were high due to overwork, disease, and malnutrition. I mean, these slaves were treated like driven into the ground, like they were treated worse than cattle. You want your cattle to survive. One of the key factors in social life of many years of American slavery during the 18th century was the presence of persons newly arrived from Africa who brought with them their culture. Different nations dominated the slave trade during different parts of history. And they did it because, nobody was clean. Every country in Europe had people who were slave traders. Why? Because it was profitable. Nobody can claim the moral high ground in the slave trade. It was profitable. And so they did it. It's once again, the ugly sides of human nature. During the 16th century, the Portuguese and the Spanish dominated the trade. The Dutch ruled the 17th. My mother, God rest her soul, and I do mean that. She always tried to act like she probably knew more than she did. She was always proud to say, well, our family is Black Dutch, thinking that was some kind of criminal element or something like that. Anytime when you're talking about ancestry and you see the word black in front of the ancestry, it means that those people are slave traders. They're also called black birders. And it wasn't even though it was a lucrative profession, it was not looked well upon. I don't think my mother knew what she was talking about. For the record, and I don't know what my great-great-grandparents did. I have no idea what my great-great-great, what they did in the 19th century. Although the place that I'm from in Alabama originally is mountain areas, and mountain areas did not lend themselves to slavery. Cotton needed flatlands. Now, did they own slaves? But I don't know. It's interesting. I can tell you one thing. I know that some of them were members of the Klan, and I'm not responsible for them. So, the Dutch ruled the 17th century. In the late 17th and 18th century, the British and some French participated. It was money. The slave trade was a triangle. Not all ships covered all legs of the triangle, but, once again, leaving England with gunpowder, guns, rum, going to Africa, get rid of that, pick up slaves, go to the New World, and this is nasty. I mean, you're talking about people living and pooping and throwing up and dying in the holds of these ships. And then they dump off the slaves wherever in the Western Hemisphere, and they would put cargo into the same place. And then people would buy that cargo. I mean, the stench in those ships was unbearable. All right. There existed a close relationship between slave trade and the wars of the African mainland. Once again, please make note of this if you ever get into a discussion about slavery. The slave trade, where you ship 10 million Africans against their will to the West, would not have been possible without the cooperation of other Africans. Slavery is not necessarily about race, and it's not. It still goes on today. Slavery is not about race, it is about greed and cruelty. During the first 4 centuries of the colonial period, here's an interesting stat. During the first 4 centuries of the colonial period, from 1500 to 1900, far more slaves came into the New World than freemen. Yeah. And you're saying, that can't be true. Well, that's because you're only thinking of the United States. But in the Caribbean, in Central and South America, yeah. There were always more men than women that were transported and survived the trip. Newly arrived slaves had to be, that word is on your test, seasoned. Say, what does that mean? Condition to work? That's such nice language. Here's what it means. How do you make someone do back-breaking labor day in, day out, no pay, no promise of pay, terrible food, under terrible conditions for all of his life? How do you do that? Answer, you beat the crap out of them at some point in time or another, or you have them see you beat the crap out of somebody else. End of story. There's no way to solve it. What's funny is, I'm telling you, history is such a funny thing. I grew up with history books in the 60s that tried to paint slavery as, a lot of slaves liked the conditions they lived. A lot of slaves had good masters. A lot of slaves were, they tried to soft sell it. There's no way. And all of them were like this. George Washington, what do you think? Oh, I'll work for you, Mr. Washington, because you're the father of our country. You're a nice man. No. Same thing with Thomas Jefferson. How do you think he persuaded Sally Hemings to have sex with him whenever he wanted? Yeah. Anyway, in the West Indies, there were far more people whose first language was African than European. Black slaves living in Portuguese colonies had the fewest legal protections. In the Spanish colonies, the church, that means the Roman Catholic Church, and I should capitalize that because it is talking about one particular church, attempted to provide some protection for the slaves. Slave codes were developed in the French and British colonies. Those were codes that specifically regarded the treatment of slaves. Some colonies made it illegal to kill your own slave, but they didn't say anything about beating. And that was only some colonies. You could, in many colonies, kill your own slave. After all, they were your property. Slave codes, yeah. Slave marriages were not recognized by law. Slave families were not recognized by law. Children of slaves were also slaves and the property of their parents' owners. Slaves often took on the religion of their masters as well as their names. Yeah, I mean, if you've ever wondered, if you ever wondered why a number of people of African American descent changed their names to names that sound Muslim, the reason is they refer to names like Horton And there are a number of African American people whose last names Horton, Robinson, Smith, Green, Bishop, all sorts of names like that. They refer to those names as slave names. And you know what? They're right. Muhammad Ali changed his name to Muhammad Ali from Cassius Clay. And what's interesting is that Muhammad Ali said Cassius Clay was a slave name, but Cassius Clay was an abolitionist. And none of that, he was a rough and tumble abolitionist. Um, Quite a rough and tumble abolitionist. We could talk a while about Cassius Clay. He was a heavy hitter, and I'm not going to talk much more. Anyway, English slaves became various Protestants. I mean, it would be interesting. The masters would have church services in a building. The slaves would normally have their church services outside under the shade somewhere, if they were allowed to. And of course, they'd have an overseer right there watching them. Spanish, French, Portuguese slaves became Roman Catholic. Africans, though, because of their native backgrounds, also became associated with mysticism. If you recall the Salem witch trials, the Salem witch trials all got their beginnings because a bunch of goofy little girls in Salem sat down and listened to a slave. Yeah, the Puritans had the Pilgrims had slaves too. Nice people. Yeah, sit down and listen to their slave tell ghost stories, and they had nightmares, and they got upset, and their parents asked them what was said, and all of a sudden they're bewitched, and so Europeans developed prejudice, though, especially against African blacks and slaves. Why? Because slavery in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century became something because of the number of slaves. So many slaves that came from Africa became associated with being black. And so the image of blackness began to carry with it negative connotations. Slave societies had existed before, for example, Greece and Rome. But the image of one race being subjugated by another on such a large scale was unprecedented in history. You better underline that sentence. Slave society, yes, had existed before, but in Greece and Rome, you'd have slaves of all colors. It just happened to be a condition of servitude. I'm trying to simplify it, but I mean, yeah, slavery is slavery, but there was not one race that were slaves. But never, as it says there, had one race been subjugated by another on such a large and unprecedented scale in history. The descendants of that institution, of course, still suffer the effect of its degradation to this day. You cannot deny that. And you know what? It's time for Johnny to get off the air. We'll continue this tomorrow. This is a short chapter. That's why I was hoping I could finish it and have a test by tomorrow, but it looks like we're not going to do that. But we could finish it by tomorrow. And so I'm going to stop now. Have a good day. Goodbye.